what I want to do is not a book about our of the we need to change our views on the world, and we need to change our economic system if we're going to survive the next few generations. It's that serious. The book, as you can see, the English version here, we launched the German version about 3 weeks ago in Berlin. It's called it's a different title. You can't read it there. It says 1% ist genug, which means 1% is enough. And the reason we called it that in German, it's actually a much better title. We had a bit of a fight with our publishers here for the English version, is because all it takes is us to redistribute 1% of GDP, to shift it from what we're doing, which is bad, like producing coal and oil and gas, to spend 1% a year for the next 20 years, and we can shift the entire system into something which is sustainable. So we don't have a huge financial challenge ahead of us. We can manage it carefully, and 1% is enough. The other reason it's called 1% is enough is that we need to get used to 1% growth, because it ain't going to come back as it was before. And there's nothing we can do to change that. No matter how much money we print, no matter how much we cut interest rates, we will never have the rates of growth that we saw for the last 30 or 40 years. Now, let me tell you something about the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome was founded in 1968 by a Scotsman and an Italian, a Scotsman called Alexander King, who was a scientist. And they got together with a group of about 25 or 30 others because they had a concern about the future of humanity. Now, if you take yourself back to 1968, those of you that are old enough, the late 60s was a very optimistic time. We were exploring space. We were trying to put a man on the moon. It was 20 years after the end of the war. Hippie times were there. It seemed like the world was going in a very good direction. And yet here's this group of people got together and said, there's a problem. And we got some money from the Volkswagen Foundation, and we went to MIT in the US, and we developed a model, this is an illustration of it, a computer model to look at the future of the world. And the result of that was a book called The Limits to Growth. And The Limits to Growth is still the best-selling environmental book ever. 30 million copies in 16 different languages. Now, most people, when they think about limits to growth, if they know about it at all, they think that it's to do with economic growth, and it's not. It's about what we call today the ecological footprint. It's about the growth of the human impact on the earth. And what they did was they measured 5 different variables. The book actually has 12 scenarios, some positive, some negative. And they looked at these different variables and what would happen over 200 years. Non-renewable resource use, population, industrial output, food output, and pollution. And they said, this particular graph is one of the scenarios called the Standard Run 3. And they said if we don't change anything, then by around 2030, 2040, the entire system will collapse. Because there will be such a build-up, too many people in the world, producing too much pollution, using too many resources, and the system will eventually fall into collapse. And the book was very positive. It said, look, if we just change things a little bit, if we just slow the rate of population growth, if we just slow the rate of economic development, and slow the rate of throughput of resources, we can avoid that. We could go forward for hundreds of years without having this crisis. Now, unfortunately, people didn't listen to that. It was discussed at the UN, it was discussed in all sorts of government levels, and there was a big debate at the time, but it was rejected. Now, we've gone back every 10 years, and this is 1972 when the book was published, and this is now. And we've gone back every 10 years, and we've tracked what's been happening. Now, what's happening today is exactly as we predicted. Not slightly, exactly. Everything is transiting out exactly as we anticipated. So we have a big, big problem, and I'll talk more about the consequences of that as we go. We now find ourselves in what we call overshoot. The carrying capacity of the planet, if you think the capacity of the planet is here, it's got a certain ability to sustain life. Now, because we're damaging that planet, because we keep filling it with pollution or digging up all sorts of things from the Earth's surface, we're actually reducing the capacity of the planet to sustain life. So that's actually going down. But because we're also pushing too hard on the growth lever, because we're using too many resources, we've passed through in fact, about 1985, we passed through the level of sustainability. And today, we live as if we have 1.5 planet Earths. In fact, in some parts of the world, in Switzerland, for example, or in the US, we live as if we had 4.5 planets. And if we carried on, then that's what would happen. And we can't do that. You can only do this for a short period of time. You can only live beyond the capacity of the Earth for a short period of time. Eventually, you'll have collapse, which is what limits to growth is about. And so what we're doing in the Club of Rome is to try and say, how do we bring that back down? How do we bring the system back into balance in some sort of managed way so that we can come back and live in harmony with nature and society? Now, the consequences of this, the consequences of us living like this, are two major classes. First of all, environmental, and the most important one, the most important consequence by far, is climate change. I'll talk a little bit more about climate change later on. I can talk about it all afternoon if you're really interested. But it is by far the most important consequence, because if we don't fix that, then nothing else really matters. Species loss. We somehow think that that doesn't matter, what we're killing off, but it really does. But it's also pollution of the air, the waterways, the soils and oceans. All of this is getting worse. And then destruction of the planet itself. So those are the environmental consequences of us pushing too hard on the levers. The social ones are just as important, and they often get much bigger headline news because people focus on the social consequences much more than the environmental ones. Greater conflict because of rising inequality, drought, resources, and climate change. So that, for example, the Syrian conflict is hugely driven because of climate change. They've had 8 years of drought in Syria, which forced a lot of people off the land into the cities, which caused different factions of groups to fight each other, which then rose into civil war. So a lot of that's been caused by climate change, and we see the same in much of North Africa today as well. The widening gap between rich and poor everywhere, I'll talk about that, and stubbornly high unemployment. Now, what we've done in this book, and what the Club of Rome is now changing its focus, because we used to look at trying to convince people to change their long-term perspective, is to try and get them to focus on short-term issues, to try and address the issues which concern them today, inequality and unemployment, but in clever ways which will also shift the long-term direction. Why do we have these problems? Now, this is particularly meaningful for me because I used to work for The Economist. Now I'm embarrassed that I did work for them. Because it's the economic system that's at the root of all these problems. Our current neoliberal system, which drives this economic growth. And this little cartoon's from the book, and it says, yes, you're homeless, but this is great for GDP. Because in GDP terms, in economic terms, a storm which washes through a city and blows away half the houses, or a fire which is now destroying parts of a city in Israel, is great for GDP. We don't count the destruction, but we count the rebuilding, and we count that as positive for GDP. Growth, economic growth, is dependent on us increasing the amount of resources we use all the time. Growth and GDP are tied together, and resource use is tied to that as well. And if we have to increase the resource use every year, and every year it has to go up higher, that's what growth is, we have to increase the amount of energy we use. And if we increase the amount of energy we use, we create more and more CO2, which causes climate change. So the economic system is actually the cause of climate change. Because we want to have more growth, we use more and more resources, which requires more and more energy, which creates more and more CO2, which causes climate change. It's not just that the economic system is causing climate change. It also does a lot of things wrong. We think that growth creates jobs, we think that growth reduces inequality, and we think that growth solves poverty. It does none of those things. We believe wrongly that growth brings jobs. You can hear politicians all over the world saying, we need growth to create jobs. It doesn't work. This is the OECD, so this is the top richest countries in the world. This is GDP from 1990 through to 2015. We experienced some of the fastest growth in human history. Spectacular rates of growth for 25 years. And you go back another 10, very high rates of growth as well. And look what's happened to unemployment. It went up. The reason for that are quite complicated, but it's all explained in here. But the reason for that is that growth is actually mostly from productivity improvements. You have to increase productivity all the time. And that means you have to squeeze more and more out of what you've got. And to do that, you have to get rid of people. You have to create unemployment. You bring in machines to make the goods more efficiently. So in the long term, a push for growth will actually increase unemployment, certainly in the rich world today. We also believe wrongly that growth reduces inequality. Inequality, so the gap between rich and poor. Economists measure this in something called the Gini coefficient. It's not very easy to read, so I'll explain it. But the Gini coefficient basically says, if the Gini coefficient is 0, then everybody in society is equal. They all have the same level of wealth. And if the Gini coefficient is 1 or 100, then one person has all the wealth and everybody else has nothing. Now, just to put that into some sort of perspective, in Europe today, the Gini coefficient is between 28 and 32. In China, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, where there was huge levels of equality, it was about 16. In the US or Hong Kong or Singapore, it's about 48. And in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 60 or 70. Huge levels of inequality. Now, if we look at the world Gini coefficient, in 1820, before, or the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, I mean, it started in Britain, but in the rest of Europe, it was only really just beginning then. It was 49. 200 years, nearly, of industrial development. All the growth of nearly 200 years. Everything that the economists tell you we need, and the Gini coefficient went up to 66. If you look at between country inequality, which is the gap between the rich world and the poor world, in 1820 it was 16. In 2000, 54. So the gap between the rich world, Europe, and places like India or Africa is 3 times bigger today than it was before the Industrial Revolution. Neoliberal economists will always tell you that there's something called the trickle-down effect. That when the rich get richer, it immediately or gradually trickles down into the pockets of the poor and nurtures everybody. It's simply not true. Thomas Piketty's famous book a few years ago about capital in the 21st century, really that's the main point it makes. That the wealth actually accumulates in the rich. The system is designed to do that. It moves money from the poor to the rich, and it moves money from the poor world to the rich world. And all these free trade agreements accelerate that process. So we're told that growth brings jobs, we're told that growth reduces inequality, and both those are lies. The third thing we're told is that growth helps reduce poverty. One of the quotes that the economist is always giving is about how the last 30 years of growth has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. The IMF and the World Bank are always saying the same thing too. 1 billion people lifted from poverty. Now, the absolute numbers, that's true. If we look at 1980 to 2010, the quality threshold is people living on $1.25. In 1980, 1.9 billion people lived in poverty. That was 42% of the world's population. 2010, it had gone down to 1.2 billion and 18%. So economic growth has had a phenomenally beneficial impact on reducing poverty across the world. But take out China, because China really is a different case. It's pursued a very dogged industrial policy very successfully and is a very big population. So China is a separate case. Take out China and, okay, the gain is less, but it's still there. But what the World Bank has not done is it's not accounted for inflation. In 1980, when it started measuring poverty, it started with $1 a day. And then about 18 years later, it changed it to $1.25 a day to take account of inflation. But that doesn't take account of inflation. If you actually take account of inflation, then in 2010, $1 a day in 1980 was $2.65 in 2010. Today, it's nearly $2.90. And if you do that, then the number of people living in absolute poverty has gone up. Despite all this economic growth, more than half the world today lives in poverty. So this great economic system, which is supposed to be so beneficial for us all, which is supposed to solve all our problems, is not just creating economic havoc, it's also creating all this ecological havoc as well. Nearly 90% of the world lives on less than $10 a day. The problem is a mindset problem. We believe that we have to have more all the time, just like a sort of rabbit. We have to have more and more carrots. And this is causing all sorts of problems which we have to solve in the next 20 years. Let me just talk briefly about climate change. I've taken all the slides that I normally have about climate change out because it's a long story. Would anybody like to explain to me what you think? I mean, we have this problem with CO2, but why is the planet heating up? Can anyone explain that? Why is the planet getting hotter? Yeah?
Is it to do with the cooling fins melting?
The cooling at the top.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the polar ice cap or the ice caps melting. Yeah. Any other suggestions? Yeah.
We're burning too much.
We're burning too much. Yeah. Yeah.
Retention of heat.
Exactly. What happens is that every day we get enough heat from the sun to provide us with 10,000 times the amount of energy we need in a year. And all this energy is banging against the planet, and most of it bounces back off into space. But because we're burning fossil fuels, and because we're using nitrates in the soils, and because we're using landfill, which releases methane, all these gases are trapping a little bit of that heat and stopping it reflecting back up into space. And since 1780, the temperature of the planet has increased by an average of just over 1 degree. There's some dispute about 1 or 1.2. But it's gone up by 1 degree. And you think, wow, that's okay. My God, 1 degree, that's nothing. You know, I experience a 1 degree temperature change every year. And we talk about the IPCC talking about a 2 degree increase. And you think, well, that's all right. So we need to think about it a different way. The human body has an average temperature of 37. And if it goes up to 38, then that's classed as a fever. And 2 degrees up, our lives are in danger. And we need to think about the planet like that. A 2 degree increase takes us back more than 10 million years in climatic history. And a 4 degree increase would take us back more than 40 million years. A 4 degree increase would actually mean that all the ice on the planet will disappear. And it's estimated that not many of us will survive that. But that's where we're heading. If we don't change what we're doing, by the end of this century, we will be at 4 degrees. And if we don't stop burning carbon fuel in the next 20 years, we'll pass by the 2 degree level in about 2040. So we have an urgent problem which we have to change. Now, for most of us living in Northern Europe, that's okay, because Northern Europe will actually benefit from a lot of these changes in temperature in the next 40 or 50 years. But if you live in sub-Saharan Africa, or you live in Bangladesh, or you live in Indonesia, or you live in South America, it's going to be a very big problem. And the migration problem we have today in Europe is going to get a lot worse. So we have a big problem, and we have to try and find a way to fix it. And we have 3 basic alternatives. We can have some sort of people's revolution. We can rise up and we can say, look, this economic system is toxic. We need to find a different path forward. Now, Occupy was a little bit about that, but it didn't really work. And I would argue that's not going to work anyway. The people on the other side are very rich, they have a great deal of power, and they're very well armed. So that's not going to have any chance of success in my view. Secondly, we can do nothing, which is what we're doing today. We're doing nothing. We've had 22 meetings on climate change, we've done nothing. We're producing more CO2 today than we've ever produced before, and it's going up every year. So if we do nothing, we will have collapse. And let's just make a quick point about collapse. Collapse does not mean that you wake up one day and the economic system is a wreck. It's not like the financial crisis. It doesn't mean that the planet is suddenly a wasteland. Collapse takes a long time. It takes 20 or 30 years. It's a long, slow period of everything beginning to unravel, socially and environmentally. And if I go back to what I said at the beginning, there's a lot of evidence that that process has begun. We haven't reached the worst of it yet, but we're seeing the threads that hold society together come apart. And what we've got to do is try and find some way to bring them back together again. The third option is to find a gradual transition, to find some way to shift the economic system in such a way that it doesn't disrupt the status quo, it doesn't make things worse, and it doesn't upset the fat 1% who are going to lose out. And that's what this is about. This is about how do you find a way to gradually make a transition. Just before I go into a few of the ideas of that, why do we not act? We've got this urgent problem, which is completely understood, that we don't need any more evidence. And yet we don't do anything about it. And I think there are 5 reasons. First of all, politics. We're stuck in outdated industrial society logic, which is financially dependent on big business and maintaining the status quo. Too many people have a vested interest in nothing changing. And so it's in our view, and we've been working with governments for the last 40 years, that they are unlikely to make the changes that is necessary. The politicians either don't get it, or if they get it, they can't do anything about it. Second reason is the vested interests. There are people who are funding all sorts of foundations around the world to make you think that climate change is not real, to make you think that the free market is a good thing, to make you think that growth reduces inequality. Big business is paying for a lot of this to happen. So the 1% is defending its position already very powerfully by confusing everybody. So that's another reason change is difficult. Thirdly, and this goes way back to even people like Machiavelli, people are actually very frightened of change. People are frightened of something they don't understand. They're frightened of the future that's maybe going to be better. They'd rather have something that they know and can trust today, even if it's bad. So people tend to be short-termist, and they have a built-in inertia, a fear of change. Fourth, timing. When Limits to Growth was published in 1972, we were too early. People were too caught up in the optimistic fervor of perhaps still the end of the Second World War. It was too early. Now, whether or not the timing is right now, I don't know. But it's certainly a lot better than it was then. Wherever I travel in the world, more and more people get it. More and more people understand that we need to make some fundamental changes. We did a big project with the Vatican last year. We helped with that Laudato Si, the encyclical. And when you have somebody like that, 3.6 billion Catholics beginning to waken up to the idea we need to change, you begin to get some leverage. So all over the world, we're beginning to see that change. Now, I don't think it's big enough yet, but it's certainly beginning to happen. Finally, the cost. There is a financial cost to making a transition to a better world. It costs more than doing nothing. And that also makes politicians nervous. With uncertain returns way into the future, which in net present value terms, which is the way economists measure it, are often very small. We have to make a transition. We have to change the energy system, for example, from something that's dirty and polluting and causing lots of problems to one that's clean. And that's going to cost a lot of money. Only 1% a year, but still, it's going to cost a lot of money. But no politician will see the benefit of that. Because built into the system within climate change, the situation will continue to get worse. No matter what we do now, for the next 20 years, it will get worse. And so you have to make some tough decisions, knowing that the world will get in a worse situation than it is today. So we have a lot of reasons why we're not doing this, but of course, the more time we wait, the bigger the problem becomes. So, this is our conclusion after all this soul searching, is we require a sizable group of informed citizens. We don't need 50%. We don't need half the world to agree to do this. We need enough to tip the balance. Now, that's probably 15 to 20% of the population. And policy initiatives that appeal to the short-term mindset of voters to gradually shift the economic system in a better direction. And that's what we're putting our efforts into now. What do we not need? The number of times I give a presentation like this, and somebody always says, first question is, what about technology? Technology will solve the problem. We don't need any technology. We have all the technology we need to solve these problems. We can have a non-carbon energy system tomorrow. It costs a bit more. But that's our choice. If we want to choose a system which costs a bit more so that we can save the planet, actually the planet's fine, it's us that's screwed. But if we choose to do it, we can shift to a better system. We don't need technology. The only thing we probably do need a bit of technology for is something called carbon capture. The the IPCC's forecast for how to bring down the amount of carbon in the atmosphere requires us to absorb carbon, to suck carbon out of the atmosphere for the next 50 years, well, beyond 2050, for 50 years or more, to bring it back down into balance. And we don't have the technology to do that, apart from something called trees. The second thing is we don't need the free market. The free market cannot solve this. So the economists and politicians that say the market will solve the problem, it can't solve this problem. It's the cause of the problem. A lot of people around the world think we can have grassroots initiatives, we can have local communities becoming more connected with nature, and we can build those up again. Those are great initiatives, and I applaud them all, but it's not enough and it's not fast enough. So that's not enough either. And we don't need instant answers. We've had some of the finest minds thinking about this problem for the last 45 years. If it was an easy answer, we'd have found it by now. This is a complicated problem and it requires a complicated set of solutions. But we don't need something which is a quick fix because it just doesn't exist. What we need is to develop a transition, an economic transition to a better system over about 20 years. To get people used to something better, which gradually shifts it from a system which is based on short-term profit and corporations to something which is for the benefit of wider society. Okay, just before I finish, the book contains 13 ways to shift the system. 12 of them are focused on providing a short-term advantage for the majority of people, and one of them is focused on managing the population, which is also absolutely key if we're to reduce these problems. I'm not going to go into all of them, but let me just pick a couple of them. Sharing jobs. In the rich world today, if you go back to Keynes in the 1930s, he wrote an essay for his grandchildren, and he said, by the time my grandchildren are old enough, they'll be able to work just a few days a week, because we'll have enough wealth, we'll have enough goods, we'll have enough of economic development that people won't need to work any longer. What he predicted has come true in the sense that we do have enough wealth, we have enough goods. If you take the GDP of Europe and divide it by the population, everybody has enough. The problem is it's badly distributed. The rich have too much and the poor have not enough. But the problem is not one of growth. We don't need growth to solve the problem, we need redistribution to solve the problem. And that's true all over the rich world. One way to do that is to appeal to the needs of the majority, to help them find a way to shift the political balance. Now, sharing jobs is one way to do that. We live in a situation today, we just take the US, where tens of millions of people are unemployed and tens of millions of people who would like to work full-time have to work part-time because there's not enough work. But if you take the people who are working full-time and you give them extra vacation, give them extra holiday, give them 2 days extra a year, and over 20 years, they get 40 days holiday. By doing that, just by gradually tweaking the system, you create enough space and you create time for that adjustment that you can absorb all the unemployment and not increase GDP. So you simply even it out over a 20-year period and you absorb all the unemployment and everybody has enough work if they want it, and everybody has more leisure time on average than they do today. So you do something which is in the benefit of the majority, and therefore in a democratic system, if that functions, and that's another question altogether, you should be able to shift or tip the balance in favor of the majority and against the corporations. Another idea called tax and dividend. This comes from a guy called Jim Hansen, who was the first, he was a NASA scientist, he was the first person to tell the House of Congress about the seriousness of climate change. And his idea, if I explain it this way, is to say, if we put $1 on a gallon of gasoline, we tax every gallon of gasoline $1, and we collect all of that tax at the end of the year, and then we divide it by the population, and we give every adult an equal share of that tax, so that everybody has an incentive for that tax. They get a direct financial gain from it. That means that, on average, the average US citizen will get $550 a year. So a couple will get $1,100 a year. Now for the poor, without a car, that's great. I get $1,100 for doing nothing. And for the rich, with the big gas guzzlers and two pickup trucks, they have a reason to start using less and less fuel. They have a reason to shift to smaller cars. And as that shift, that transition takes place, you put the tax up to encourage it to move further. And you can do that in all sorts of ways. But you make sure that when you tax something which is bad, you give it to the majority of people so that they have an incentive to want that thing. Another way to gradually shift the system. Third one, which is very obvious and really helping the poor world, is to restrict trade. We've got this bonkers idea that open and free markets is good for everyone. It's not. It's a way for corporations to move goods around the world for their advantage. That's the primary advantage of free trade. Now, there are times that it's very helpful, but for much of the poor world, free trade is a ticket to forever remaining poor. So we need to find a way to say to our politicians, let's not have free trade always. Higher corporate wealth taxes, that's pretty obvious. Finally, minimum wage. Some countries, Switzerland had a vote a few months ago about providing a minimum wage for everybody, and they voted against it, which was a bit silly. But this is a theme which is coming up all over the world. There's one province in Canada which is now going to offer everybody a basic income all their life of between $400 and $600. This is an idea whose time will come. It's not quite there yet, but it's certainly getting there. We've done a calculation which says if you take taxes from the rich and you increase those, is it possible to give everybody a basic income for life? And our calculations show you can't. The rich are not rich enough to make that work. But what you can do is you can give it to everybody who really needs it. You can provide the unemployed, the sick, and the elderly with a basic income, a guaranteed basic income of about a third of the average, which is about $15,000, $20,000 a year. Every rich world society can afford to do that. And so that's the advantage of the majority. It also makes the transition to a better world easier. If people who work in the coal, oil, and gas industry lose their jobs and they're guaranteed a basic income of about a third of the average, they don't have to live on the streets. They find a way that they can move to a better world. The transition becomes easier. So again, it's another way of providing an incentive to gradually shift the system. Now, the book's got 13 of them. If you're interested, you can read all about them in there. There's even a little presentation online with lots of cartoons that explain them as well. So I will leave you to look at that if you're interested too. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Please go and tell the world that we need to change. Thank you.